Hello again. Okay, so this is the second primer that I wanted to do in the first week of our course, and that's just a primer on feminist art and kind of just a really um, basic introduction to feminist thinking about the history of art. And it's going to be not necessarily quick. I always say these things are going to be quick, and then it's probably going to be like a half hour, but still preliminary, shall we say. I just kind of gathered together a few artists that will give us a starting place in talking about feminist art, but there is so much wonderful work that I'm missing. If you have a favorite feminist artist from the from any time, but maybe particularly in the past 20 years, please feel free to share on the Discord. This is one of the really cool things about having an asynchronous course is that we can share things more easily than we could if we were meeting in person. So if there is a feminist artist that you are on fire about, please share. I would love to see it. Okay, but now, where to start in thinking about feminist art? I'm going to start by talking a little bit about an extensively anthologized essay by Linda Nochlin called Why Have There Been No Great Women Artists? Um, and I didn't have us read this paper, although I considered it because it is so famous. I decided to save things for the syllabus that I really wanted you to actually read yourselves. And Linda Nochlin is worth reading, and it is one of the optional further readings that I have. But I think that I can kind of capture the main things that I wanted to take away from it just in this brief primer. So, but I am going to use it as a starting place. So let's think about this question. Why have there been no great female artists or women artists? This might be a question that you have encountered at some point, or a question that you have thought to yourself. Where is the female Michelangelo, or the female Leonardo, or the female Van Gogh? It doesn't appear on the surface when you study the history of Western art that there are women artists kind of working at that level, or at least not with that kind of fame. And so when we think about that question, one of the answers that first pops to mind is that women just don't quite have what it takes, just don't quite have the golden nugget of genius that needs to be expressed in great art like Michelangelo's Pieta or something like that. And we're going to talk more about the idea of genius in the third week of the course, I believe. So we'll talk a lot about that, and many of the things that I touch upon here, we're going to talk about in more detail as we get going. But that's kind of like a starting response. And I feel like oftentimes when this question is posed, that's the answer that the person asking has in the back of their mind. It sort of poses as sort of a challenge, like, well, if women are just as good as men, um, show me the female Michelangelo, or why have there not been any great women artists? I remember when I was in my early 20s, I actually had a friend tell me that he had never read a book by a woman that he thought was really good. How do you respond to this? Well, first of all, you can respond, well, what have you read? Or what artists have you considered? In other words, you can take the question at face value and try to give it a straightforward answer. You could say, actually, there have been great women artists, possibly overlooked, possibly kind of in the shadow of the artistic men close to them, because many of the women who we know of through the history of Western art did come from families with some kind of artistic connection. Their father was an artist, or a brother or a husband, or something like this. And in fact, that's not unusual for male artists as well, to have some kind of a connection to that world where they started to apprentice as a young person with someone they knew. Of course, not across the board, but it is common. Um, with women artists, they are often introduced by way of that connection to a husband or a father or a brother. I did come across one example of a son who was a very famous artist, whose mother was also very famous. I'm going to talk about her in a bit. So that's kind of the first approach that we can take to answering this question, is to leave the standards for what counts as great art and a great artist just as they are. The same standards by which Michelangelo and Van Gogh and Picasso are great artists, could leave that all the same and say there are some women in the history of art who meet these standards, who should be counted as great artists. In the second half of this video, I'm going to show us some images and present a few possible candidates. In fact, they will be women who make it into the Jansen. I don't know if any of you are familiar with Jansen History of Art, but I got this as an undergrad because I started in art history before switching to philosophy, and so I went through the Jansen to find the women who are there. There are a few, there's one or two in each century. Anyway, we'll look at them. Where's my notes? Okay, but the drawbacks of this approach, although it does have positives to it, it is very much worthwhile to remember the successful and prominent women through the history of Western art. The kind of drawback of that approach is that it doesn't quite dig deep enough into thinking critically about the standards that are in place for great art and great artists. So it doesn't question at all that frame for assessing or evaluating greatness. And in fact, that word itself, great, can have a male connotation. I have a vivid memory of being a grad student in a course, and the instructor talked about the great man coming into the room. I completely forget the context of this now, but at the time it bothered me because I could not imagine this person saying the great woman came into the room. Just doesn't sound the same and probably would not happen. And so it was very present to me how a certain idea of greatness is sort of gendered male. Okay, so a drawback with the first approach, just trying to extend that same idea of greatness to women, is that it does not critically examine that idea itself. So what is a second possible response? The second possible response, sorry, my notes are a bit, is to start to question those standards. And one of the ways that we can do that is by thinking about the material and social conditions under which art that has been considered great has been produced, and kind of demystifying our ideas about what it takes to be a great artist and how a great artist produces their work. It still is quite common to think of artists in this kind of romantic way as being geniuses who they just have some kind of great feeling or great experience well up in them, and then it gushes forth into their artwork in a kind of semi-divine act of creation from nothing. And it's a sort of genius that couldn't be stopped by circumstance, that was going to express itself no matter what happened. And this kind of account of genius thinks of the genius as being sort of a sole individual who, regardless of where they come from, their class or station in life, their brilliance as in drawing or in painting was going to come out one way or another. And so it gives the artist kind of full responsibility for the expression of their genius. And if we have that idea of artistic greatness and what it is to be a great artist, then the explanation, the sort of natural explanation for why there haven't been so many great women artists, is that women as individual creators have not had that kind of brilliant internal experiences or feelings that were going to gush forth into amazing artworks that changed expectations for the medium or pushed things forward in a new way or something like that. So a part of addressing that very idea of what an artist is to kind of slow down and start to think about the material conditions and the social conditions that allowed certain undeniably brilliant individuals, but still were necessary for them to become great artists. And to start to think about how much work, how much training it was required to master the techniques of, say, oil painting for several hundred years, when what counted as great art was going to be large history paintings, say, with lots of nudes, scenes that illustrated myths from the ancient Greeks, or biblical stories, big war scenes, things that had a kind of grand scene presented to you. Working on that scale, being able to draft nudes and paint them, this was something that required a lot of work and training. And so the sponsorship of somebody to give you that training or to take you on as an apprentice, and how did that work? How did people wind up in that position? What kind of resources around them made it possible for them to then go on and do this thing? When we start thinking about that, and also how the material conditions of the production of art excluded most women from even having a shot at it, it can, as I say, sort of demystify this idea of the artist as kind of a solo genius who's solely responsible for their own brilliant artistic output. Instead, that output becomes a product of a particular social material place, a reality. So the second possible response to this question, why have there been no great women artists, is to say, well, actually, our ideas of greatness are flawed in a way, because it assumes this kind of sole responsibility on the part of the brilliant genius artist. And we need to look at, historically and sociologically, at what conditions were required in order for work that was considered great to come about, and how those conditions excluded women and others from having the chance to try to do that. So one of the ways that this can go is by kind of completely putting aside the idea of assessing who was a truly great artist and employing the aesthetic criteria connected to our ideas of great art as just sort of unsalvageable, just kind of so deeply intertwined with a certain gendered way of thinking and with historical conditions that excluded women, that we just can't use those standards for assessing aesthetic merit and achievement. So that can be a part of this sort of second approach. Instead of employing aesthetic criteria for deciding which art is great and which artists are great, we just shelve that whole kind of project and only focus on doing history, talking about, describing the conditions under which certain things were happening for some people and not for others. That approach can also be really important and really freeing. It can also have the drawback that we are no longer able to assess the relative aesthetic merit of different artworks. And I think that kind of flies in the face of our experience of art. Michelangelo's Pieta is just great. So I think this is a really wonderful work. And do we have to sort of pretend we don't notice that? That would seem a bit odd. It also leaves us without the ability to aesthetically assess differences of value between works made by women, potentially. So I think we do have aesthetic responses to objects that warrant their own kind of evaluation. I'm putting this forward now. You might not agree with me, but yeah. And so we want to retain some language to address that aspect of our experience of artworks and artists. People argue this in different ways. Griselda Pollock is somebody who's often mentioned as arguing against applying kind of traditional aesthetic criteria to assess the relative value of works. And Christine Battersby, who we're going to read on Genius, is somebody who has argued for continuing to talk about a specifically aesthetic kind of value. And if we don't want to use the traditional criteria for that, we can come up with new criteria, kind of feminist criteria for assessing the aesthetic merit and value of different works. And that's a really interesting idea. From what I've read of her, we didn't quite get to the positive explanation of what that new feminist criteria for aesthetic valuation would be. I'm not quite sure how to go about creating that. It seems like that would be kind of there's a challenging project to take on, but also an exciting one. At any rate, I mentioned that as a possible direction that one could go. Um, and that's really the third possible response to the question. So you ask, why have there not been any great women artists? First response is, well, there have been. We can just apply the same standards as always and find a few women who have managed in their material conditions to be able to produce art that meets that standard. Secondly, we can say there's something about that criteria itself that we want to dispute or think critically about. And we want, instead of talking about artistic genius and artistic greatness, we just want to focus on what was actually happening at various times that allowed certain people to produce work that was considered great and others not to be able to do that. Just want to kind of accurately and thoroughly describe that situation in order to dispel the sort of mythologizing of the artist that's often involved in conversations of artistic greatness. And then thirdly, the third possible response is to say, okay, yes, we need to think critically about the traditional standards for assessing greatness and aesthetic value, generally speaking, but rather than foregoing that kind of conversation entirely, let's explore new standards. Let's take everything that we have learned from thinking about the world from a feminist perspective and come up with a new way of talking about art and a specifically aesthetic kind of value that things have that incorporates that perspective. That's the third. Okay. So I'm going to pause here and jump to the slideshow.